So this is my desk. It was modeled after the Four Eyes furniture desk from about 4 or 5 years ago. I made mine about 3 years ago, and we made a lot of compromises. I cut corners, and frankly, this just got to be really embarrassing. So let's turn away from this and take a look at what I'm calling the kickback desk. And unfortunately, it's exactly what you think. The last video on my channel was the Four Eyes Furniture Moonfry bed. I bought the plans, I built the bed, it all came out great, and I was really happy with the end result. One of the unexpected consequences of doing that project was the challenge I felt to improve my own design and creativity. I talked about this a little bit in the video, but I'm not particularly creative. So I really wanted to challenge myself, do something I had never done, and design a piece with a ton of new elements that would really push me to my limits as a woodworker. And this was the result. I have affectionately named this desk the Kickback Desk. And yes, it's exactly what you think it is. Before you get too nervous, nothing terrible happened. I'm okay, but it was a big eye-opener and definitely something I want to pass along to viewers to make sure that they don't find themselves in a similar situation, because it wasn't your traditional kickback. But we'll get to more of that later. Let's keep working on this build. So everything you've seen up until now is just milling the lumber. I'm jointing a square edge, I'm marking the reference edge, I'm taking it to the planer, milling it down to the thickness that I need, and then getting a square edge on the table saw. I've went over this process in depth in several other videos, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on it, and we'll instead jump right to lumber selection. Now, with all the boards ready, I can start deciding what I want to go where. There's a lot of variation in white oak, especially quarter sawn white oak. You can see a lot have those flakes and some don't. So I move the boards around a lot to decide what I like, and then I start marking them. That way I don't get confused during the glue up. Now let's take a closer look at the actual design. The top's going to be made of 6/4 material that gets milled down to about 5/4, and then everything you see in green is actually going to be 4/4 material milled down to about 3/4 of an inch, and the gray section you see is actually going to be stacked plywood, and that's how we're going to make the curve for this. I did notice before I started gluing that I still had a gap there, so I'm going to do the in-out method, which is where you mark corresponding boards with an I and an O for in and out, and you put the I against the fence, joint that side, and then joint the opposite side with the O away from the fence, and that cancels out any kind of deviation or misalignment you might have with your fence and gives you much better joints, like you see here. Now, all of the 5/4 material that I had was nice and flat, but you can see here this 3/4 is just too long and really wavy, so we're going to break out the domino in order to help with alignment. And because this is a video, we can skip right ahead to the glue up being dry. We can take it out of clamps, and then I'm actually going to head over to my local cabinet shop and use some of their equipment. Now, while you enjoy this beautiful scenery in northern Indiana, let me go ahead and explain why I decided to use a cabinet shop here. This shop rents out time. It's not even a really consistent fixed rate. Usually I pay between $20 and $45 to go in there and get panels sanded and squared up. And I got both of these things done in about 25 minutes, and I only paid 30 bucks. It's an absolute no-brainer and gave a great result. So back at the house, we can get everything unloaded and start in on this continuous wrapped grain filing cabinet. Try saying that 5 times fast. I decided to use my track saw for this just because the panels were so long. The table saw just simply wasn't going to be an option. And I took my first cut nice and slow. Everything was looking really good. And then when I took the track off and measured it, it looked clean as can be. So I was really excited at this point on how these angles were coming together. The combo square is showing a perfect 45. Like, yeah, this will be no problem. And then I started working a little bit more, and I was like, okay, well, I need to support this other wing, and well, that's not working super well. And then the track was starting to slide on me, and then the board was starting to slide, so I was clamping the board to the workbench, then clamping the track to the workpiece, and then I needed to support the track, and it just became an absolute mess. Okay, so we are due for an update. I ended up needing to turn the camera off to figure out what was going to work best, but originally we were working on our continuous grain miters over here. It ended up being just a lot on the saw to be at that angle and cut all the way through. I was getting a lot of burning. The track was starting to shift on me. The miters were going to be bad. So I was like, okay, I'll switch over to the table saw. I cut over here, just straight lines for each panels, and then I went back and did my miters. And honestly, I think they're going to be fairly close. You can still see the grain runs up and down. It just won't be dead on 100% continuous. But again, not worth doing something dangerous in order to try something new. That's just stupid. So trying new things doesn't inherently mean you'll be successful. Sometimes you got to try and make compromises in order to pursue safety or a better idea or whatever. So let this be a lesson to you guys to take from me. Don't do anything you're not comfortable with, even if it's in pursuit of something new. Let's keep working. Later that evening, I could go ahead and line all my panels up and mark out for dominoes. I am actually using dominoes both for strength and alignment in this case. However, before we do our glue up, I do want to add some edge profiles to the filing cabinet. If I haven't mentioned it up until this point, this is the Desquire filing cabinet. That was kind of the foundational springboard for this design, and then from there out, I kind of added things that I liked and needed for my own space. But this is where the desk gets its name. So you can see I'm cutting this 45-degree angle, and there's a little piece that kind of got stuck to the side. I just moved out of the way. I didn't think anything about it. And on this next piece, it gets pinched just so, to just shoot right off. Oh, man. Even rewatching this just makes me cringe. I think what happened was the dust collection, the piece was light enough that the dust collection was able to suck it in just a little bit, and it was enough to catch the blade, and the blade just shot it right off like a projectile. And again, praise the good Lord, I was mostly out of the way. It did manage to stick me right in the rear end, which was a real bummer, but super grateful that it wasn't worse. I don't think there's anything safety-wise I could have done differently. I'm just super grateful it wasn't worse. And after I got over the fact that, man, that's a little embarrassing, I realized it would definitely be worth sharing in this video because, yeah, it's a safety thing. Like, that can happen, something to be aware of. And if sharing this with all of you guys, kind of laughing at myself a little bit, save someone else from experiencing the same or worse, definitely worth it every time. So with that out of the way, we can get back into the video. Now, like I said before, our dominoes are going to add some structural support as well as alignment. What I like to do when gluing up mitered boxes is to go ahead and permanently attach the dominoes into the top and bottom, and then mortise out the holes on the sides oversized. That way I have a lot of room to move about. Once I have everything dry fit, I could go ahead and take a measurement for that interior panel. This is solid wood, so I made it a little undersized to allow room for wood movement. That way that panel could expand and contract and not bust those miters open. And then I went and double checked to make sure everything was square. Now I know what you're thinking, crap, he forgot to put the panel in. And that is not quite true. I intentionally left the panel out so that way I could glue up the bottom miters, get everything nice and square, and then I just used that top panel as a support and a proper spacer. Then after that cured, I went back, swapped out my clamps to make them spreaders, spread that joint ever so slightly just to be able to work that top panel back in after I got my divider panel installed. As you can see, this worked out really well and gave me a really nice clean miter joint along all the sides. Then, later that evening, I could come to take everything out of clamps and realized you guys don't want to watch me take clamps off. Let's go ahead and there we go. That's better. Now we can take a look at our box and see how our waterfall came out. Now, I know there's a few really tiny gaps here at the top, but on the whole, the grain wraps really nicely. Considering the issues I was running into with cutting these miters, I'm pretty happy with what that looks like. I'm just gonna take I think this is my pocket hole drill bit, and just kind of brandish those corners a little bit and rub that miter together, and that's gonna close up those seams nice and tight. Next, I could get the drawer slides installed and then turn my attention over to making the template for the base. This project has a ton of firsts. Just to mention a few, the wrapped grain on the filing cabinet, this curved base, and a tapered panel that's going to make up the rest of the base. I knew this curved base was going to be the star of the show, so I wanted to make sure I did a really good job here creating this template that was going to help us get it dialed in. Okay, let's get a little closer and kind of talk about how I made this shape, because I feel like it deserves a little bit more of an explanation. And you can actually see it over here versus the time lapse is a little fuzzy. So I want the leg to be 2 inches wide. So I marked from the corner 2 inches over, and then using my speed square, and I'm just gonna do a quick demonstration. I'm by no means an expert carpenter as far as like framing and stuff, but I know how to use the speed square, or at least one of the uses. If you're trying to get an angle, you can mark this corner as your pivot, which is why it has a little arrow that says pivot. And then you can go out to, down on this side, whatever angle you're looking for. So we wanted 16 and a half, it's right about there. And then that lines us up over here, give or take. I'm doing this one-handed, so bear with me. But that is a 16 and a half degree angle. In the same way, if you wanted a 20 degree angle, it would be there at 30 degrees, so on and so forth. I'm honestly embarrassed for the amount of time it took me before I actually knew how to use these. I'd always just use them to, hey, there's 90 and there's 45, and I would never use anything else. And it's a really handy tool to have. So that's how that works. But we wanted a 16.5-degree angle. We wanted it to go up 27 inches in height. And then I wanted a nice rounded bent look here. So I tried both the paint can and the stain can, the gallon and the quart. And I like the more aggressive curve of the quart. The paint can was just a little too gradual. So we did that curve. At the end of the curve, I marked 2 inches over just so I had a nice stopping point. And then this will be our template for the curved portion of the base. And then I'll mark out another length over here, and I'll probably just do it lengthwise, just as MDF to get templates, so it doesn't really matter where it's at. But I'll mark out the full length that I'll need, and we'll get the templates made and refined, and then we can start cutting out a million pieces of plywood to stack them together to give the illusion of bent wood, because I don't have a steamer, nor do I have bendy plywood. So this is what we're gonna do to make it happen. Then, with the assistance of my track saw, my bandsaw, my miter saw, and my sander, I was able to get this template cut out. Don't worry if you don't have all these tools, they're not essential, they just make it go a little bit faster. You could do the same thing with a jigsaw and a regular palm sander. So I mentioned in the start of the video that I'm not extremely creative. It takes a lot for me to create something totally unique. But in the bed video, I do talk about how I'm a worker. I have a grinder's mentality. And I thought this just served as a great example of marrying those two things. I forced myself to grow and to design and create something totally unique, but I still managed to make it the most labor-intensive process I could possibly come up with. And honestly, I think that's exactly where you want to be if you're trying to push yourself to do new things. 1 foot in chaos, 1 foot in order, that's where you grow. Okay, so now I apologize if this sounds bad. My mic got lost in the move. I still need to order a new one. If you have any recommendations, leave it in a comment down below. But moving on. We are ready to start gluing up all of these pieces. These took an insane amount of time to put together, but hopefully it all ends up being worth it. So my plan is just to run some glue, stack them, line up the edges, leave the bottoms kind of long, and then brad nail through to keep everything where it should be, and that should really help minimize the amount of movement or shifting that you would otherwise get in a glue of this size. So I think I'm gonna do them in maybe a couple of batches, just because there's a lot of these, so maybe like batches of 7 or so. I'll count and see how many I have and then divide them evenly, but that's the plan, so we're gonna get to work. This is where things started to get really fun. I started to see that 3D shape take form, and it was really exciting. I did decide to do this in batches. I did, I think, 9 plywood pieces per batch, and then dominoed and glued those together. I figured my chances of totally nailing all alignment on all 37 pieces was pretty slim. And breaking them up and then just doing dominoes made everything a lot easier. But you can tell just clamping it together, everything looks pretty well aligned. So far, so good. Then later that night, I could take everything out of clamps and start to get a look at what this piece is looking like, and I'm pretty happy. The domino really helped with alignment and definitely paid for itself on this project. Now we're gonna get everything a nice quick sanding. I think I just used 150 grit here just to smooth things out and make sure we have a nice flat substrate for our white oak veneered plywood to go on. After that, I turned my attention to the top base stretcher piece, I think is what I'll call this. Basically, this will connect at the top of the curved piece and run the full length of the desk, laying on the filing cabinet once everything's said and done. Now, I could have done the same brad nail and glue setup here, but I've got a plan for this panel that I want to implement in the final look. I don't know if it's going to work, but we're going to give it a shot. With that set aside and in clamps, I could go ahead and cut all of the pieces on the bottom of the curved section to length and at the 16.5-degree angle that we were looking for. Okay, so here's the situation. I glued up this panel, which is going to serve as the support for the top of the desk or the desktop itself. I'll throw an image here, that way you can see kind of what this piece is going to make up. In the drawing, I had this piece tapering down toward the filing cabinet, and I really like that look. Unfortunately, I got distracted while I was gluing it up, and I glued up this massive panel that is too big to fit in my 20-inch planer, and I have no way to do that taper without using a planer sled. So unfortunately, I'm going to have to rip this down the middle, plane it. I should have ripped these individual boards thicker, The current size is 2 inches. I should have done that about 2 1/4. That way I had plenty of room to work down. That way it would match up to the curved portion of the desk that you just saw me working on. I'm hoping that I can plane just a smidge off of these, add the taper, then joint those pieces back together, and then I can blend that edge well enough that it should not be too noticeable. Worst case scenario, I'll have to cut this piece off, buy another sheet, maybe 2 sheets of plywood, and rip it down. Overall, expensive wise, not too terrible, but in terms of labor, there's a lot of hours here. So I'm hoping I can make this work. Nothing to it but to do it. Let's get back to work. Now, for all of you wondering what the heck I am talking about, let's take a closer look. So this is a planer sled I whipped up pretty quickly with some scrap wood. I propped up one end of the workpiece 1/4 of an inch and I marked on the workpiece how far down I wanted to plane. The planer is going to reference the bottom of the sled, so the fact that the workpiece is tilted up should, in theory, add a taper. Okay, so we got both pieces planed down. I'm not really sure this was worth it. The look is going to be very, very subtle. We jumped just a smidge under 2 inches. That's like a 1/16. I'm pretty sure I can blend that. Sorry, bad camera work. Pretty sure I can blend that in order to match that piece. Down to this end, we are about 1 inch and 11/16. So there is a taper. The taper is going to be on the bottom. And I'm going to do some profile edging at the end there. I hope this was worth it. Either way, it was kind of a fun new thing to try. I'd seen it on, I cannot remember the video or the person who posted it, but I saw it on a recent YouTube video and thought it'd be kind of cool. Seems like a nice, cool way to put an elongated taper on a really thick piece like this. So we'll see if it was worth it at the end. Let me know. With everything shaped and sanded, we could start in on our glue up. I got this cleaned up and glued back together off camera. Now I'm just attaching some clamping blocks. I'm gonna clamp this together and mark for dominoes, but this is one of the beauties of making this out of plywood and doing it this way and just veneering the top. I can put screws anywhere I want because this is gonna be veneered. Actually, this part will be under the desk, but this part will be veneered and you won't be able to see the screw holes. So I added blocks to the top of this one, top of that one, as well as underneath on both to get as much good clamping pressure as I can because this is going to be a bit of a funky joint, so we want to make sure it comes together well. Additionally, another bonus to doing it out of plywood like this as opposed to the bending ply or whatever, or kerf cutting, is I ended up making this too short. And a really simple fix was just to cut pieces of 3/4 inch plywood and stack them up. Here, I added glue and screws and tacked them in place and followed up with screws up. So they should be plenty secure. I'm not worried about it not being strong enough. But yeah, that would have been impossible if I was kerf cutting or using bending plywood. I would have had to remake this entire piece. And in this case, just using regular plywood and veneering the whole thing, the substrate can look as ugly and inelegant as it wants. It's still gonna work when it's all said and done. So let's get this clamped up, marked for dominoes, and we'll get that glue up rolling. I went ahead and got those dominoes mortised off camera, and when I was going to put things together, I realized I was having some alignment issues and had inadvertently flipped the top upside down. And somewhere along the way, I added one extra piece of plywood to that top stretcher piece that should not have been there. So we'll have to cut that off later. But overall, the glue up went fairly well considering how funky of an angle this was. Those clamping blocks really helped, and thankfully I have a couple 10-foot pipe clamps that I keep in my shop for just such an occasion. But I did have to be careful with these. They have enough pulling power that if I pulled too tight, they would flex that top out of level. So I had to keep an eye on that and actually loosen those up as I went through the glue up. But overall, it looked pretty good, and those seams are easily within blending range. The next day when I came back, I was a little unsure. I mean, this is just a really weird glue up. I thought I had good connections, but you just never know, and this is kind of a make or break it point for this entire project. So I got the clamps removed and gave everything a nice thorough sanding, and we were starting to look pretty good. I was getting real excited with how everything was coming together. Then I could use my track saw to nib off that extra little bit of plywood that had no business being there to begin with, and go ahead and hit that side with a little bit of sanding again to make sure that we had a good substrate for our veneer. Like I mentioned before, I do want to add an edge detail here just to add another little bit of visual interest on the desk, and that's just a 45-degree angle hitting in at the halfway point of that piece. Now I could take my almost completed filing cabinet, put that in place, and then move this behemoth of a base over and figure out how tall the base of the filing cabinet would need to be in order to level out the base top. As you can see here, we're pretty well tilted, But thankfully, between my floor jack and a couple of cans of stain from our fence project, this was able to get everything leveled up nicely. Okay, so I've taken the measurement here. I got my level nice and level. The garage slants this way for water to run out. It should be relatively level this way. So this should be sufficient. The desk that the room's going in is going to be carpeted, so it should be fine. Now I need to figure out how tall to make the base, which is why I jacked this up and got the desk base level. And now I'm just going to take a measurement here. We are at 3 15/16. That seems like a little bit of a tall base, essentially 4 inches for a toe kick. Most toe kicks are 3 to 3.5 inches. So I think what I'm going to do is sit the base back up on the table and rip off maybe a 1/2 inch worth of the bottom piece of plywood that I added on, and then I should be able to make a 3.5 inch tall base, and we'll be off to the races. Now, for those of you detailed viewers still following along at home, I did talk about adding screws up from the bottom of the base through those extra pieces to gain that extra bit of height that I needed. I did back those out prior to this cut, so no issues there. Then off camera, I mitered together a box out of scrap white oak. I drilled oversized holes and used pocket hole screws with washers in order to secure the base to the filing cabinet, and that should allow plenty of room for wood movement. Coming along nicely, we got the base on the filing cabinet, and we are perfectly level with the desk, the other half of the desk base. And this is not going to be the top of the desk. The top of the desk is actually leaning against the wall over there. It's going to lay on top of this and be a little bit wider. So it's going to be a pretty sizable piece, but again, I wanted to have room for everything I need. I have 3 monitors, a printer, etc., and this should very much handle those needs. So we're going to get the drawer faces cut and installed on the back side of the desk. I've already got a couple of floating shelves sitting down there, and I drilled the pinholes for the adjustable shelving. Again, this is the desk from the 4 Eyes Furniture desk wire build. I wanted to incorporate this piece of it because I love the design and I need a filing cabinet, but I also wanted to design something totally unique and different on the other half of the desk. So let's keep on working. And now we're back on familiar territory. We're doing drawer faces here. Super easy, super straightforward. I like to do it in one solid panel and then rip each drawer face as I work my way up, adding those 1/8 inch spacers. Nothing really to report here. The drawer faces went on really smoothly. I did, however, not have the handles in the mail yet. I ordered them off Amazon, and unlike every other Amazon product I've ever ordered, they took like 2 weeks to get here, which I know, I'm a millennial, I want things right now, I get it, but still. I was a little upset I didn't have handles, so as a quick fix, I added some green tape just as pulls, that way I could get the doors open and close as needed. Now, while we wait for those handles, we could turn our attention back to the base. Now remember, the entire goal here is to make this look like it's authentically bent wood. So in pursuit of that goal, I'm adding a thin 1/8 inch strip of in-grain edge banding to the end here. That way, if anyone's ever on that side, they'll see this and it'll be convincing. As for the side panel, I did try to cut segmented pieces to wrap that side, and no matter what I did, it just wasn't coming together very cleanly. And I think this is partly user error, but also partly to do with how much grain variation can be found in the white oak. So even if you manage to get 1 or 2 grain lines matched up, the rest of it would still be inconsistent. So instead, I decided to just use the veneer and veneer on the full piece using contact cement, and this worked out really, really well. Then later that evening, once the contact cement had time to cure, I went back with a flush trim bit on my palm router and then a 150 sanding block to clean up those edges and a 220 sanding disc on my sander to really smooth things out and blend it all nicely. And then with the dopamine hit of that first piece of veneer going on so well, I decided to roll into the next one. I added contact cement to the curved portion of the base as well as the oak veneered piece that I cut out to cover that portion. You have to put it on both sides and let them cure up for a little bit. Once everything was tacky to the touch, I used a couple of pipe clamps and had my wife help me put it in place. I apologize for the shoddy camera work. I was so concerned with making sure everything had good placement that I wasn't paying attention to the camera. It was really funny, as you can see, as I start working the curve, Heather gets so concerned it's going to snap and wants to be nowhere near it in case it goes wrong. Thankfully, nothing bad happened. It went on really, really easily, and I used a pressure roller just to further activate that contact cement and make sure we had a nice, good bond. From there, it was just rinse and repeat. I did the exact same thing on the bottom side of the base using clamps and a couple pieces of scrap wood to keep from making contact inadvertently, because once this stuff touches, it does not want to release. That's the whole point of contact cement. But if you're careful and go slow, it goes pretty smoothly, just removing clamps and boards out of the way, really working the connection in and making sure things are nice and tight. Again, I followed up with a flush trim bit and 220 grit sanding, really just to blend everything nice and flush and get a consistent look there. Once that was done, we could go visit our old friend, the desktop, and start laying out our marks for the stainless steel standoffs that we're going to use to elevate our monitor stand. These standoffs are actually designed for signs to stand off of a wall, so in order for them to work in this application, I did have to recess out small holes underneath the monitor stand. I used a Forstner bit and then followed that through on the center with a regular drill bit to mark the hole on the opposite side, then widen that hole up, that way the threads from it could fit through and sit nice and flat. Once that was done, we could get working on the assembly here, just making sure everything comes together. Some of these were not totally dead on perfect, but we were able to flex them into place and it looked pretty clean. A few days later, our hardware finally arrived, so we could go ahead and get the table saw set up to recess out a groove on the top of the drawer face in order for these to sit flush and secure in the back with just a couple of screws. Now, if you'll recall at the beginning of the video, I showed you the 3D drawing that had this cable management panel / shelf that matched the curve of the leg. When I first did this, I accidentally measured it like this, and that was incorrect. It was not fitting well at all, and I couldn't figure out until I remembered that the leg sits this direction. So once I marked that out and got it cut, I had a really nice clean fit. Everything was looking good. Then off camera, I ripped that piece in half and made it into that L-shaped shelf that you saw in this 3D model, just using screws, pre-drilling, and countersinking. This doesn't have to be fancy since it'll be underneath and no one will ever see it. And again, one of the huge benefits of making this out of plywood is that I can just pocket hold this directly into the base and not really worry about the wood movement between the base itself and the shelf because the base is plywood and plywood doesn't really expand and contract all that much. So this is a pretty safe way to attach, get nice tight joints, and not have any issues down the road. Or if I do, well, it'll be a surprise for future me, but I think this should work just fine. And now we're finally on to the final sand and finishing. I sanded with 120 and 150 grit, and then I actually found that if I used 220 grit and pressed pretty hard, I could get rid of those burn marks without losing the profiled edge on my desk. So that was a nice tip that I had not found up until this project. Finished here, we're using Rubio Monaco, no surprise here. I did end up putting up a poll on my Instagram page whether I should go with Rubio Pure or Rubio Cotton White. I know a lot of makers like to use Cotton White with white oak, but the sample I did just did not look very good. And our new office has a set of white oak built-ins that I was fortunate enough to inherit when we bought the house. And I really wanted these two pieces to complement each other rather than compete with each other. Man, I can't tell you how satisfied I am with this build. I tried a ton of new things. I really pushed myself on a creativity front and on a workers front, and I think the results speak for themselves. But I would love to know what you guys think down in the comments below. Until next time, get out there and start your own project.